On the night of March 23, 1993, 7 men left their homes in Breathitt County, Kentucky, and disappeared into the fog-shrouded hollows along Stillwater Creek. By dawn on March 24th, 12 people lay dead across 8 square miles of Appalachian forest, all adults, all eliminated with hunting rifles and shotguns. The perpetrators, the Brennan family, father and 3 sons, moving through the darkness like a surgical team. The Kentucky State Police would later call it the most methodical rural elimination in eastern Kentucky history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't drugs, wasn't a generations-old blood feud, wasn't even money. It was a broken promise, a $22,000 timber contract that vanished in the night, and one man's unshakable belief that a handshake meant more than any written law. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Breathitt County, Kentucky, sprawled across 495 square miles of some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States in 1993. The mountains here didn't just rise. They erupted from the earth in jagged limestone ridges that turned dirt roads into vertical nightmares when the rain came. Population stood around 16,000, down from 22,000 in the 1970s, when timber was king and coal still mattered. The county seat, Jackson, held barely 2,400 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back decades. Out in the hollows, places like Stillwater Creek, Lost Creek, and Troublesome Creek, families lived in isolation so complete you could go weeks without seeing another human being. March in Breathitt meant temperatures swinging wildly, 38 degrees at dawn, 65 by afternoon if the sun broke through. The air smelled like mud and rotting leaves, mixed with the sharp scent of pine sap and wood smoke from coal stoves. When fog rolled down from the ridges, and it rolled down every night that March, visibility dropped to 20 feet. Sound traveled strange in those conditions. Sometimes you'd hear a gunshot 5 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his hand was on your shoulder. But 1993 was a brutal year for timber country. The logging industry that had sustained Breathitt County for nearly 80 years was in collapse. Environmental regulations from Washington had locked up vast stretches of forest. Spotted owl habitat, watershed protection, reforestation requirements, all of it meant less cutting, fewer jobs, families watching their livelihoods evaporate. Unemployment in Breathitt County hovered around 37%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives in the timber business, felling trees, running sawmills, hauling logs down impossible mountain roads, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, just disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the grocery store checkout. In that economic wasteland, timber contracts were gold. Not the big corporate operations, those had pulled out years ago, but private contracts between landowners and independent loggers. Handshake deals to clear specific tracts, split the profits, keep families fed through another hard winter. The mountains provided everything. Old-growth timber worth premium prices if you knew where to find it. Hidden valleys where cherry and walnut grew tall and straight, and a network of logging roads known only to locals, mapped in the memories of men who'd walked these ridges since childhood. The sheriff's department was understaffed and underfunded, 4 deputies covering 495 square miles. State police barracks sat 43 miles away in Hazard. FBI presence was theoretical at best. In Breathitt County, the law was more a suggestion than a reality. Thomas James Brennan was 57 years old that March, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. 6'2", but stooped forward from 3 decades of physical labor that had compressed his spine like an old spring. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently scarred from chainsaw accidents and cable breaks. A thick beard, more gray than brown, covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, the kind of eyes that looked through you rather than at you. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of a logging accident in 1979 when a widowmaker branch had fallen 40 feet and shattered his left femur in 3 places. The doctors in Lexington had put him back together with steel pins and screws, told him he'd never work again. Thomas had been back in the woods 6 months later, limping but working, because men like Thomas Brennan didn't know how to do anything else. Every morning, Thomas woke at 4:45 a.m., made coffee in a percolator so old the handle had been replaced twice, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a Bible his grandmother had given him in 1958. Not because he was particularly religious, he'd stopped believing in a merciful God somewhere around 1982, but because the ritual grounded him, gave him 15 minutes of quiet before the day's demands crashed down. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Camel, rolled so tight it lasted 20 minutes, and then he'd step outside to watch the sun come up over Frozen Creek Ridge. He'd listen to the mountain waking up, crows calling, distant chainsaws starting, the occasional rumble of a logging truck grinding up some impossible grade. Then he'd start his day, check the equipment, sharpen chainsaw blades, plan the cutting schedule, monitor the timber haul from the Morgan tract, the contract that was supposed to save his family. He'd married Sarah Lynn Combs in 1961, right after his discharge from the Army. They'd had 3 boys. Michael, now 32, who could operate a chainsaw like he was born holding one. David, 30, quieter than his older brother but twice as strong. And Jacob, 27, the youngest, still trying to prove he belonged in a family of men who measured worth in cords of timber cut and trucks loaded. Sarah was 55 now, her face worn smooth by worry and mountain living. She'd buried her own father in a logging accident, watched 2 brothers leave Kentucky for factory work in Ohio, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband and sons were one bad contract away from losing everything. What Thomas valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with 3 adult sons to feed and equipment that broke down faster than they could fix it. What he valued was his word, his reputation. The idea that when Thomas Brennan shook your hand and said a thing would be done, you could stake your life on it. His father had taught him that, his grandfather before him. In these mountains, where written contracts were rare and lawyers were expensive luxuries, a man's word was his bond. Break it, and you were nothing, less than nothing. The timber contract with Clayton Morgan represented everything. 6 months of work, 300 acres of prime hardwood on Morgan land up near Quicksand Creek, cherry, walnut, oak, trees that had been growing since before the Civil War. 50-50 split on the profits. Thomas had calculated it out, $22,000 minimum, maybe $30,000 if the wood graded high. That money would pay off the bank loan on his equipment, would get Michael's truck fixed, would put David's wife through the medical procedure she needed, would give Jacob enough to finally propose to his girlfriend with a ring instead of empty promises. On February 3, 1993, Thomas Brennan had stood in Clayton Morgan's living room and shaken the man's hand. No written contract, didn't need one. Both men were from these mountains. Both understood that a handshake carried the weight of blood. That handshake represented everything Thomas believed about how men should deal with each other. Honor, trust, the old ways that held communities together when everything else fell apart. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he shook Clayton Morgan's hand and smiled at the promise of 6 months' good work, was that some men saw handshakes as suggestions, not obligations. And that betrayal of trust would cost 12 people their lives. The betrayal came on March 19, 1993. A Friday morning when the temperature hit 42 degrees and fog hung so thick you could barely see across the road. Thomas had driven up to the Morgan tract at dawn, same as he'd done every morning for 6 weeks. The cutting was going well. They'd already hauled out 40 loads, the timber grading even better than expected. Premium cherry. Walnut with grains so beautiful it would fetch top dollar at the mill in Hazard. But when Thomas turned onto the logging road that led to the tract, he found it blocked. A chain across the road. A new chain, the steel still bright and unmarred, and behind it, Clayton Morgan's truck. Thomas got out slowly, favoring his bad leg. Clayton was standing beside his truck, arms crossed, face set in an expression Thomas had seen before on men about to deliver bad news. "Clayton," Thomas said. His voice was neutral, but something cold was already forming in his gut. Thomas. Clayton wouldn't meet his eyes. Why's the road blocked? Need to talk to you about the contract. What about it? Clayton finally looked at him. I'm terminating it, effective immediately. The words hung in the March air like smoke. Thomas felt his hands open and close at his sides. We had an agreement, Thomas said slowly. Verbal agreement, nothing in writing. We shook hands, Clayton, in your living room. Your wife was there. She made us coffee. Things have changed. What things? Clayton looked away again. Harlan Woodworks offered me a better deal, 20% more than we agreed on. They're bringing their own crew in on Monday. Thomas stood there for a long moment, just breathing, watching fog swirl between the trees, calculating what Clayton was saying. We've already cut 40 loads, Thomas said quietly. 6 weeks of work. I've got $8,000 in equipment costs, fuel, labor. We had a 50-50 split agreement. I'll pay you for the loads already cut. Market rate, same as I'm paying Harlan. That's not what we agreed. Take it or leave it, Thomas. I don't owe you anything beyond that. We didn't have a written contract. Something shifted in Thomas's chest. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder. The understanding that the world he'd believed in, the world where a man's word meant something, where a handshake was binding, didn't exist anymore. Maybe never had. You're ending 6 months of work over 20%, Thomas said. It's business. It's a handshake, Clayton. It's your word. My word don't pay bills. Thomas looked at the man he'd known for 15 years. They'd gone to the same church. Their kids had played together. Thomas had helped Clayton repair his barn roof 2 summers back, worked for free because that's what neighbors did. I'm giving you until Monday morning, Thomas said. His voice was flat, empty of emotion. Sunrise on March 22nd. You honor our agreement. We forget this happened. Or what? Or you learn that some debts get settled the old way. Clayton straightened up, trying to look tough. You threatening me, Thomas? I'm giving you fair warning. Mountain rules. You know them same as me. Man breaks his word to another man's family, the debt gets settled. Thomas turned, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. Didn't look back. Didn't trust himself to look back. 3 witnesses saw the whole exchange. 2 of Clayton Morgan's neighbors who'd stopped to see what the commotion was about, and David Brennan, who'd been waiting in his own truck 50 yards back, ready to start the day's cutting. That conversation spread through Breathitt County within hours. By sunset Friday, everyone knew the Brennans and the Morgans were headed for trouble, but people had been predicting feuds and violence in Breathitt County for 100 years. Mostly, it was talk. Mostly, men backed down before things went too far. Mostly, the deadline came and went like a stone dropping into dark water. Monday, March 22nd, 1993, 6:00 a.m. Thomas Brennan stood on his front porch watching the sun rise behind Frozen Creek Ridge, and nothing had changed. No phone call came, no truck pulled up the driveway. No Clayton Morgan appeared to make things right, just silence and the slow understanding that Clayton had made his choice. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel. Maybe he didn't think you were serious. Thomas didn't turn around. He knew I was serious. Then call the sheriff. Let the law handle it. Sheriff's 43 miles away. By the time he drives out here, takes statements, files paperwork, if he even bothers, the timber will be cut and hauled by Harlan's crew. Money gone. Contract gone. He finally looked at her. Besides, you know how this works. Mountain handles mountain. Sarah's face went pale. She knew what that meant. Everyone in Breathitt County knew what that meant. Thomas, please, think about the boys. I am thinking about the boys. What kind of man lets someone break their word and does nothing? What kind of father teaches his sons that you can be cheated and just accept it? He turned back to watch the sunrise. I gave fair warning. Rest is on him. Sarah went back inside. Thomas heard her crying in the kitchen but didn't follow. Some decisions you make alone. 4 days earlier, on the Thursday before everything fell apart, Thomas had driven into Jackson with his youngest son, Jacob. They'd gone to the hardware store for chainsaw parts, stopped at the post office, grabbed lunch at the diner on Main Street. Normal things. Father and son running errands like they'd done 100 times before. Jacob was 27, still young enough to believe the future held something better than Breathitt County's slow collapse. He'd been talking about starting his own logging business someday, not because he wanted to, but because it was all he knew. The mountains were in his blood the same way they were in his father's. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, red vinyl cracked and patched with duct tape, ceiling fan wobbling overhead. The place smelled like fried grease and weak coffee. Jacob ordered a burger and fries. Thomas got the meatloaf special, same thing he always got. "Dad," Jacob said, pouring ketchup on his fries, "you really think Morgan's going to back out?" Thomas chewed slowly, thinking. Outside the window, Main Street sat mostly empty. Half the storefronts were boarded up. The movie theater had closed 3 years back. Even the bank had reduced its hours because there wasn't enough business. "I think," Thomas said finally, "a man does what serves his interests. If Clayton can get more money from Harlan, he'll take it. Handshake or no handshake." "But that's not right." "No, it's not." Jacob set down his fork. "So what do we do?" Thomas met his son's eyes. "We remind him that some things matter more than money, that a man's word used to mean something in these mountains. Still should. And if he doesn't care, then we make him care." The weight of those words settled over the booth. Jacob understood what his father was saying, understood the code that had governed these mountains for generations. When someone breaks faith with you, you don't turn to the law, you handle it yourself. Thomas smiled, reached across, and squeezed his son's shoulder. "You're a good boy, Jacob. Going to make something of yourself." That was Thursday afternoon. On Sunday, Thomas discovered Clayton had hired Harlan's crew. On Monday, he realized Clayton wasn't backing down. And now, Monday evening, Jacob would be helping load rifles into the back of his father's truck, his future as an honest logging contractor evaporating before it even began. The preparation started Tuesday morning, March 23, 1993. Thomas woke before dawn and drove to his brother-in-law's place 12 miles away, up near Noble. Ray Combs was 64, retired from logging after a falling tree had crushed 3 vertebrae and left him with chronic pain. But he still kept an impressive gun collection, relics from better times when men hunted to feed their families and bought quality weapons they could pass down to sons and grandsons. Ray sat on his porch, heating pad pressed against his lower back, coffee mug steaming in the cold air. "Thomas, awful early for visiting. Need to borrow some hardware, Ray." The old man's eyes narrowed. He'd lived in Breathitt County long enough to understand what hardware meant at 5:15 in the morning. "This about that Morgan situation. He broke his word to me. I gave him a chance to make it right. He chose wrong." Ray was quiet for a long time, sipping his coffee. Finally, "How many you need?" "Enough for 7 men." "Jesus, Thomas." "He crossed the line, Ray. I can't let it stand." Ray struggled to his feet, shuffled inside, came back 10 minutes later with 3 rifles, a Remington 700 in 30-06, a Marlin 308, and an old Winchester Model 94 lever action in 30-30. "These are yours to keep," Ray said. "Consider them a gift." "But Thomas..." He gripped Thomas's arm with surprising strength. "You do this. There's no coming back. You understand that?" "I understand. Your boys will go to prison. You'll die in prison. Sarah will be alone." "I know." Ray let go, shaking his head. Morgan should have honored that handshake. Over the next 24 hours, Thomas quietly assembled an arsenal. His own deer rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in 30-06. Michael had a Remington 870 shotgun, 12 gauge. David owned a .357 Magnum revolver he'd bought at a gun show in Lexington. Jacob had inherited their grandfather's Springfield 30-06 from World War II. 3 cousins, Robert, Samuel, and William Combs, all had hunting weapons accumulated over years of deer season and target practice. Thomas didn't buy anything new, didn't need to. This was Appalachia, where every household owned guns the way city people owned umbrellas, necessary tools for a hard environment. But he did buy ammunition: 4 boxes of 30-06, 3 boxes of 308, 6 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, and 50 rounds of 357. He spread the purchases across 5 different stores: one in Jackson, one in Hazard, one in Manchester, one in Beattyville, one in Campton. Paid cash, kept the receipts in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. Some part of him still believed in documentation, in proving he'd done things legally right up until the moment he didn't. Tuesday afternoon, Thomas spread topographic maps across his kitchen table. USGS maps showing every ridge, hollow, and creek in eastern Breathitt County. He'd been walking these mountains since he was 6 years old, knew them in daylight, knew them in darkness, but planning required precision. He marked the Morgan compound with a red X, the main house plus 2 trailers where Clayton's sons and brother lived. Marked the escape routes with yellow highlighter. Marked where each of his men would position themselves with blue circles. Michael stood beside him, studying the maps. "This is military, Dad. Like Vietnam." "Vietnam taught me how to stay alive when people were trying to kill me," Thomas said. "Taught me patience, taught me that emotion gets you killed, but planning keeps you breathing." He tapped the map. "We do this right. Nobody gets hurt that doesn't deserve it. And if they have weapons? If they fight back?" Thomas looked at his oldest son. "Then we fight harder." At that moment, while Thomas Brennan and his sons planned in their kitchen, Clayton Morgan was watching television in his living room, completely unaware that 7 men had decided he and everyone connected to him were marked for elimination. The TV played Wheel of Fortune. His wife brought him a sandwich around 7 p.m. Normal Tuesday evening, normal life. He went to bed that night thinking about the Harlan crew starting work Wednesday morning, about whether the timber would grade as high as they'd promised, about the extra money that was coming. He didn't think about Thomas Brennan at all. 11:42 p.m. Tuesday, March 23, 1993. Temperature had dropped to 36 degrees. The moon was a thin crescent, providing almost no light beyond what the stars offered. Fog rolled down from the ridges, thick and cold, turning the forest into something from a nightmare. Visibility maybe 20 feet. The only sounds were wind moving through bare branches and the distant trickle of Stillwater Creek, half a mile down the hollow. Thomas Brennan sat in his 1986 Ford F-150, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the trees ahead, maybe 300 yards distant, he could see the Morgan compound, the main house and 2 trailers arranged in a rough triangle. A single yellow security light casting long shadows. Through one window, the blue flicker of a television. Tuesday night, family home, probably watching Letterman. Settling in for the evening, completely unaware that 7 armed men were positioning themselves in the darkness. Thomas's breathing came slow and steady. He'd expected his heart to race, expected fear or maybe even last-minute doubt. Instead, he felt nothing but cold purpose, like he'd already stepped outside himself, like he was watching Thomas Brennan, the one about to become something he could never come back from a great distance. He picked up his Winchester Model 70, opened the chamber, confirmed the round was seated properly, closed it with a quiet click, breathed the cold air deep into his lungs. "Dad," Michael said from the passenger seat, "last chance." Thomas looked at his oldest son, 32 years old, face already lined from hard living, good man, devoted father to 2 little girls. About to throw his life away because his father had decided honor mattered more than freedom. "We're past that point," Thomas said. "Been past it since Sunday." Michael nodded. "Then let's finish this." Thomas opened the door, dome light disabled hours ago, and stepped into March darkness. 6 other doors opened simultaneously. 7 men, armed and silent, moving through fog like shadows. They'd rehearsed this, knew their positions. Thomas and Michael would take the main house. David and Jacob would take trailer 1. The cousins, Robert, Samuel, and William, would take trailer 2 and secure the perimeter, cut off escape routes, handle anyone who ran, military precision. The Army had taught Thomas that chaos gets you killed, but discipline gets you home. Tonight, discipline would get 12 people eliminated and 7 Brennans imprisoned for life. Fair trade in Thomas's mind. They moved through forest without speaking, using hand signals Thomas had learned 35 years ago in boot camp. Temperature kept dropping. Thomas's breath made small clouds in the air. His boots crunched on frost-covered leaves. Behind him, Michael's breathing was controlled, steady. His boy had always been good under pressure. At 11:47 p.m., they reached the tree line. The Morgan compound sat in a clearing maybe 40 yards across. The security light buzzed, moths circling it despite the cold. From the main house, Thomas heard laughter, television audience, late-night comedy. From Trailer 1, music, country station, someone listening to Garth Brooks. Trailer 2 was dark, silent. Thomas raised his hand. Everyone froze. Waited, listened, no dogs. The Morgans had 2 dogs, but Thomas's cousin William had handled that problem earlier. Poisoned meat left by the road, cruel but necessary. Dogs bark. Barking alerts neighbors. This needed to happen fast and quiet. Thomas lowered his hand, the signal to move. At 11:52 p.m., they crossed the clearing. 7 men, rifles ready, spreading out like they'd planned. Thomas and Michael reached the main house first. Thomas put his hand on the door, aluminum, cold under his palm. This was it. Last possible moment to turn around, to wake the Morgans, tell them he'd changed his mind, leave without bloodshed. He opened the door instead. Clayton Morgan sat on a worn couch, beer in one hand, watching David Letterman. He turned at the sound of the door opening, saw Thomas, saw the Winchester. Understanding came to his face slowly. Confusion first, then recognition, then fear. "Thomas, what the hell?" "You had your chance," Thomas said, voice flat, empty. "Deadline was sunrise yesterday. Sun's been down for hours." Clayton started to stand. "Now wait just a—" The Winchester barked once. Clayton fell backward over the couch, beer bottles shattering on linoleum floor. The television kept playing, Letterman making a joke, audience laughing at something nobody in this room would ever find funny again. Thomas heard screaming from the bedroom. Margaret Morgan, Clayton's wife. Michael moved toward the hallway, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "Women and children don't matter, just the men." "She saw us, Dad. She can identify—" "Women and children," Thomas repeated. "That's the line." They left Margaret screaming in the bedroom and moved to Trailer 1. 11:58 p.m. Trailer 1 sat 20 yards from the main house, belonged to Clayton's younger brother Dennis, 41 years old, worked at the sawmill in Hazard, had nothing to do with the timber contract beyond being related to Clayton by blood. David and Jacob approached from opposite sides. Through the window, they could see Dennis sitting at his kitchen table, working on something. Looked like he was filling out paperwork, tax forms maybe, pencil in hand, reading glasses perched on his nose. David knocked, 3 sharp raps, footsteps inside, door opening. Dennis Morgan stood there in a flannel shirt and jeans, pencil still in hand, that easy expression mountain people wear when a neighbor comes calling. The expression died when he saw the rifles. "Oh, Jesus," he whispered. "Dennis," David said quietly. "Please. I got nothing to do with whatever's between you and Clayton. I just work at the mill. I don't—" "You're a Morgan," David cut him off. "That makes you guilty." Dennis backed into his trailer, hands raised. "I got a wife. She's asleep right there." He pointed toward a closed bedroom door. "And 2 kids, little boys. They're just babies." Jacob hesitated. Looked at his brother. For the first time that night, David saw doubt flicker across his younger brother's face. "The kids didn't do nothing wrong," Jacob said quietly. "Their father's brother broke his word to our family," David said. But his voice wavered slightly. Dennis saw the hesitation, pressed it. "You kill me, those boys grow up without a father. You want that on your conscience? You want to look at yourself in the mirror knowing you made orphans?" David's rifle stayed raised, but his finger moved away from the trigger. "Dad said just the men involved," Jacob whispered. "Dennis wasn't involved," David whispered back. They stood there in the doorway, 2 brothers, armed, facing a man who had nothing to do with the broken contract except sharing blood with the man who'd caused it. "Get out," David said finally. Dennis blinked. What? Get your wife and kids. Get in your truck. Drive away. Don't come back tonight. Don't call anyone. Don't stop until you're in the next county. David, Jacob started. Do it now, David said to Dennis, before I change my mind. Dennis ran, woke his wife, grabbed his children, 2 boys, 4 and 6, barely awake, confused, crying, piled them into his truck in their pajamas, engine starting, headlights cutting through fog. The truck disappeared down the driveway. David and Jacob stood in the empty trailer, looking at tax forms spread across the kitchen table. Evidence of a normal life, a man trying to do his taxes before the April deadline. Dad's going to be pissed, Jacob said. Dad can be pissed. I'm not killing a man over his brother's mistake. They walked back toward the main house just as gunshots erupted from Trailer 2. 12:03 a.m., Wednesday, March 24, 1993. Trailer 2 belonged to Clayton's 2 sons, Marcus, 28, and Shane, 25. Both worked with their father in the timber business. Both had been there when Clayton had made the deal with Harlan Woodworks. Both had known exactly what breaking the contract with the Brennans would mean. Robert, Samuel, and William Combs, Thomas's nephews, all in their 30s, had surrounded the trailer, covered both exits. When Marcus had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette at midnight, he'd walked directly into their ambush. Don't move, Robert had said, rifle aimed at Marcus's chest. Marcus froze, cigarette halfway to his lips. What the? Combs? What is this? Your father broke his word to my uncle. You were part of it. That's just business, man. Nothing personal. It's personal when you steal food from a man's family. Shane had heard voices, came to investigate, saw his brother at gunpoint, tried to run back inside to grab his own rifle. William caught him at the door. The shotgun blast cut Shane off mid-stride. He fell across the threshold, half in and half out of the trailer. Marcus dropped his cigarette, raised his hands. Jesus Christ, you killed my brother. Your turn, Samuel said. Wait, I got a daughter. She's 3 years old. Her name is Emma. The second shot dropped Marcus beside his brother. The cousin stood there, looking at 2 bodies, 2 men in their 20s, one of them wearing a UK Wildcats t-shirt. The other had a Garfield mug still sitting on the table inside, coffee probably still warm. Think we did the right thing? William asked quietly. They knew what their father did, Robert said. They could have talked him out of it, could have made it right. They chose to let it happen. But his voice carried uncertainty. The kind that creeps in after you cross a line you can't uncross. They moved away from the trailer, leaving Shane and Marcus Morgan where they fell. While the Brennans moved through the Morgan compound eliminating targets with mechanical efficiency, 2 miles away, an elderly woman named Ruth Patterson sat on her porch, wrapped in a quilt, unable to sleep. She was 82 years old, had lived in Breathitt County her entire life, had buried 2 husbands and 5 of her 8 children. The mountains had taken them in various ways: mining accidents, car crashes, one to cancer, one to a heart attack at 47. She sat in her rocking chair listening to the night sounds, distant dogs barking, wind through the trees, the whisper of Stillwater Creek running cold over limestone. She heard what might have been gunshots, distant, maybe 3 miles away, but sound traveled strange in these hollows. Could have been a truck backfiring, could have been someone hunting possum. She rocked and listened and thought about nothing in particular. Tomorrow she'd read about it in the paper. Would shake her head sadly the way old people do when they've seen too much of humanity's darkness. Would say something like, Lord have mercy, what's this world coming to? But for now, she just rocked and counted stars through gaps in the fog and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Thomas found himself standing in Clayton Morgan's workshop, the building where Clayton had kept his timber business records, his contracts, his equipment. The place smelled like sawdust and machine oil. A desk in the corner held files, invoices, receipts, timber contracts, and there, on top of the stack, Thomas saw it. The contract with Harlan Woodworks, dated March 18, 1993, 20% higher payout than what Thomas had been promised. Clayton's signature at the bottom, bold, confident. Beside the Harlan contract, Thomas found his own agreement with Clayton, except it wasn't an agreement. It was a handwritten note. Verbal contract with T. Brennan, $22K for Morgan Tract, 50-50 split, Feb 3, 1993. Clayton had documented it, had written it down, had known exactly what he was doing when he broke faith. Thomas stood there holding both pieces of paper, feeling something crack in his chest. Not rage, grief. The grief of watching a world he'd believed in, where handshakes meant something, where men kept their word, revealed as fiction. Michael appeared in the doorway. "Dad, we need to move. Someone might have heard the shots." Thomas set the papers down carefully. "How many?" "4 dead. Dennis and his family got away. David let them go." "He what?" "Said Dennis wasn't involved. Let him take his wife and kids and run." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "David did right. This is about the contract, about the men who broke faith, not about killing everyone with the wrong last name." "What now?" "Now we make sure everyone who is involved pays their debt." But Thomas's voice had changed. The certainty from earlier was gone, replaced by something hollower. The understanding that killing 4 men hadn't brought back his contract or his money or his faith in how the world was supposed to work. It had only created more emptiness. Not everyone connected to Clayton Morgan was at the compound that night. Jerry Whitaker, Clayton's business partner in the Harlan deal, lived 8 miles away near Quicksand Creek, 53 years old, owned the trucking company that would haul the timber. Had negotiated the 20% premium that convinced Clayton to break his word. Thomas knew this, had planned for it. "Michael, Jacob, you're with me. David, stay here with the cousins. Anyone shows up, handle it." They drove through fog so thick the headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead. The roads were narrow, winding, covered in patches of black ice where creeks had overflowed. The truck's suspension groaned over potholes that could swallow a tire. Nobody spoke, just the engine's rumble and the heater blowing cold air that gradually warmed. At 12:51 a.m., they pulled onto Jerry Whitaker's property. The house was dark except for a single porch light. Jerry's truck sat in the driveway. A dog barked from somewhere behind the house, a chain rattling, aggressive barking that cut through the night. "Dog's gonna wake him," Jacob said. "Good," Thomas replied. "Want him awake for this." They approached the house. The dog's barking intensified. Thomas knocked, 3 loud raps that echoed in the stillness. Lights came on inside. Footsteps. The door opened a crack, chain still latched. Jerry Whitaker peered out, squinting against the porch light. He was wearing pajama pants and a white undershirt, hair messed from sleep. When he saw Thomas Brennan standing on his porch at 1 in the morning, holding a rifle, his face went white. "Thomas, what the—" "You know why I'm here, Jerry." Jerry's hand moved toward something behind the door. Thomas raised the Winchester. "Don't." Jerry's hand stopped. "This is crazy. You can't just— You convinced Clayton to break his contract with me, offered him 20% more. You knew we had an agreement. You knew what it meant to my family." "That's business, Thomas. Nothing personal. Clayton made his own choice." "Business?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "My family's survival is business to you?" "Look, I got a family too. I was just trying to—" The shot cut him off. Jerry Whitaker fell backward into his house. From somewhere inside, a woman screamed, Jerry's wife. Thomas stood in the doorway, looking at the body, a man in pajamas, probably been asleep 20 minutes ago, dreaming about nothing in particular, now dead because he'd seen an opportunity to make extra money and hadn't cared who it hurt. "Dad," Jacob said quietly. "His wife?" "Women don't matter," Thomas said, but his hands were shaking now. 5 dead. 5 men who'd woken up Tuesday morning with no idea it would be their last day breathing. They left Jerry Whitaker's wife screaming in her house and disappeared back into the fog. Buck Hensley lived in the small cabin 3 miles from the Morgan compound, 47 years old, foreman for Harlan Woodworks. He'd be the one supervising the crew that would start cutting Wednesday morning on Thomas's tract. Buck had known about the original Brennan contract, had even told his boss it wasn't right to poach work from another logger. But when the boss said, "Do it anyway," Buck had followed orders because men with families didn't turn down steady work over principle. Thomas found him in his cabin, still awake. sitting at his kitchen table going over the cutting schedule for Wednesday. A pot of coffee on the stove, country music playing low on a radio. Buck heard the truck outside, thought maybe it was one of his crew stopping by with a question about tomorrow's work. He opened the door before Thomas could knock. Saw the rifle, understood immediately. "Brennan," Buck said. Not a question, just acknowledgement. "Buck?" They looked at each other. Two men from the same world, both loggers, both trying to survive in an industry that was dying around them. "I told my boss it was wrong," Buck said quietly. "Told him poaching another man's contract wasn't right. But you took the job anyway. I got 3 kids in school. Youngest needs braces. Wife's got medical bills from when she had her gallbladder out. What was I supposed to do? Turn down work? You were supposed to say no." Buck smiled sadly. "Easy to say when you're the one holding the rifle." "Not easy at all," Thomas said, and meant it. "You gonna kill me over this?" "You're part of it. You knew." Buck nodded slowly. "All right then, but Thomas, you kill me, my wife's got nobody. Those kids got nobody. You're making orphans, making a widow, over timber." "Over principle," Thomas corrected. "Over men keeping their word. That going to matter when you're in prison, when your own boys are locked up, when Sarah's sitting alone in that house wondering what happened to the man she married?" The words hit Thomas harder than any physical blow could have, because Buck was right. This wouldn't bring back his contract, wouldn't restore his faith in handshakes, would only destroy more families. But he'd already killed 5 men, already crossed the line. There was no going back now. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "No, you're not," Buck replied, "but I appreciate you saying it." Thomas raised the rifle. Buck closed his eyes. "Tell my wife," his voice broke. "Tell her I love her. Tell my kids their daddy tried to be a good man." The shot echoed across the hollow. Buck Hensley fell in his kitchen doorway, coffee still brewing on the stove, radio still playing, Garth Brooks singing about friends in low places. Thomas stood there, rifle still raised, waiting for emotion, for horror or satisfaction or anything human. Felt only exhaustion and the terrible understanding that he'd become exactly what he'd always feared, a man who killed to protect pride disguised as principle. Michael touched his arm. "Dad, we need to go." They went. But Thomas looked back once at Buck Hensley's cabin, at the lights still burning, at the evidence of a normal life interrupted mid-sentence. 6 dead now, 6 families destroyed, and the night wasn't over yet. The last target wasn't in Breathitt County at all. Paul Morrison lived in Hazard, 23 miles away, 51 years old, accountant for Harlan Woodworks. He'd been the one to run the numbers, to calculate that Clayton's tract was worth the 20% premium, to advise the company that poaching the Brennan contract made financial sense. Thomas had discovered this Tuesday afternoon while researching exactly who was involved in stealing his work. Had found Morrison's name on paperwork in Clayton's office, had traced the decision back to its source. Morrison's house sat in a quiet neighborhood off Route 15, small ranch-style home, 2-car garage, lawn mowed neat, the kind of place where accountants and teachers lived, where people worked regular jobs and didn't worry about whether handshakes still meant something in the mountains. Thomas sat in his truck, engine idling, looking at the dark house. A basketball hoop over the garage, a swing set in the backyard. Kids lived here, normal kids who went to normal schools and had no idea their father had helped destroy Thomas Brennan's livelihood. "Dad," Michael said, "this one's different. He's not from the mountains. He doesn't know our codes. To him, it really was just business. He knew what he was doing, knew someone would lose work so Harlan could profit. He's an accountant. He probably doesn't even know your name. Just saw numbers on a spreadsheet." Thomas stared at the house. Michael was right. Paul Morrison probably had no idea Thomas Brennan existed, had probably never thought about the real human beings affected by his calculations. "We already killed 6 people tonight," Jacob said from the back seat. His voice was hollow. "How many more before it's enough?" "Until everyone who was part of it pays," Thomas said, but his certainty was crumbling. "He's got kids, Dad," Michael said. "You can see the swing set. We kill him, Those kids wake up without a father. Over numbers he ran on a calculator. Thomas sat there, engine idling, hands on the steering wheel. Thought about his own children. About Michael's 2 daughters who'd grow up visiting their father in prison. About Jacob, who'd never get to start his own logging business now. About David, who'd never be able to look at himself in a mirror without seeing the men he'd killed tonight. About Sarah, who'd be alone. All of it for what? To prove a point? To show that breaking your word had consequences? 6 men were already dead, 6 families destroyed. And Thomas couldn't even remember what Buck Hensley's face had looked like before the bullet hit. Couldn't remember if Jerry Whitaker had worn glasses or not. The men were already becoming numbers in his head, bodies instead of humans. "Let's go home," Thomas said quietly. "What?" Jacob leaned forward. "We're not—" I said let's go home. Thomas put the truck in reverse, backed out of Paul Morrison's driveway, started the long drive back to Breathitt County. In the back seat, Jacob was silent, confused maybe, relieved maybe. Thomas didn't know and didn't ask, but as they drove through darkness toward home, Thomas understood something fundamental had broken inside him. Not his resolve, his humanity, the part that separated him from the animals he used to hunt in these mountains. He'd set out to prove that a man's word still mattered. That honor meant something. That breaking faith had consequences. Instead, he'd proven only that violence created more violence. That revenge didn't restore what was lost. That killing 6 men over a broken contract didn't make him righteous. It made him a murderer. The truck's headlights cut through fog. The road unwound before them. Behind them, 6 bodies cooling in the March night, 6 families waking to horror, and ahead, a future where everything Thomas had tried to protect, his family, his reputation, his principles, would be destroyed anyway. 6:47 a.m., Wednesday, March 24th, 1993. Ruth Patterson's daughter, Linda, drove to her mother's house at sunrise like she did every morning, brought her breakfast, eggs and toast, coffee already made, still hot in a thermos. But as she turned onto the road that led past the Morgan compound, she saw something wrong. Dennis Morgan's truck parked at a strange angle in a ditch, driver's door open, engine still running. Linda slowed, pulled over, got out, called toward the truck. "Hello, you need help?" No answer. She approached carefully, found the truck empty, keys in the ignition, a child's stuffed animal on the seat. Then she looked toward the Morgan compound and saw Margaret Morgan stumbling down the driveway in her nightgown, barefoot, screaming. Linda ran to her, caught her as she collapsed. "Margaret, what happened?" Margaret couldn't speak, just pointed back toward her house. Her eyes were wild, unfocused, the look of someone whose reality had shattered completely. Linda helped her to the truck, called 911 on her cell phone, one of the new mobile phones that barely worked in these mountains. The signal cut in and out. But she got through. "I need police. The Morgan place off Route 1812. Something's wrong. Mrs. Morgan is hysterical and—" She stopped. Through the trees, she could see into the Morgan property now. Could see a body on the porch of the main house. Could see the door to Trailer 2 hanging open. Could see shapes on the ground that shouldn't be there. "Oh God," Linda whispered. "I need everyone. There are bodies, multiple bodies. Send everyone." By 8:15 a.m., Breathitt County Sheriff Thomas Burke was standing in the middle of the Morgan compound, looking at 4 bodies and feeling his understanding of his county fundamentally shift. Burke was 61 years old, had worn the badge for 34 years. He'd dealt with moonshine violence, family feuds that turned deadly, the occasional domestic murder. He'd pulled bodies from car wrecks and mine collapses, had investigated the drug overdoses that came when OxyContin flooded eastern Kentucky like a plague. But 4 people eliminated in one night, across multiple locations, with military precision. This was different. Kentucky State Police arrived at 9:30 a.m. Captain James Whitfield, 49 years old, 25 years in law enforcement. He'd worked cases across eastern Kentucky from Hazard to Prestonsburg. Had investigated everything from marijuana grows hidden in the Daniel Boone National Forest to domestic murders that tore families apart. He stood in Clayton Morgan's living room, looking at the body, studying the bullet placement, the lack of struggle, the cold efficiency of it. This wasn't rage, Whitfield said. This was execution. Sheriff Burke nodded. Clayton Morgan was eliminated first, I think, then his sons in Trailer 2, then Jerry Whitaker and Buck Hensley at their homes. 6 dead? 6 confirmed. Might be more we haven't found yet. They walked the property. Evidence markers everywhere. Shell casings collected. 3006, 308, 12 gauge. Tire tracks in the mud. Boot prints leading from the tree line to each building. Multiple shooters, Whitfield said. At least 4, maybe more. They surrounded the property, covered exits. This was planned. Any witnesses? Dennis Morgan and his family. He was here when it started, but somebody let him go. He's at his in-laws' place in Lee County. Says 2 men, David and Jacob Brennan, told him to run. Said they'd kill him if he called anyone before dawn. Whitfield straightened. Brennan? Burke nodded. Thomas Brennan and Clayton Morgan had a dispute over a timber contract. Clayton broke their handshake agreement, hired Harlan Woodworks instead. Thomas gave him until Monday to make it right. And when he didn't, this, Burke gestured at the compound. This is what happened. By noon, investigators had traced the pattern. All 6 victims connected to the broken timber contract. All 6 eliminated within a 2-hour window. All 6 killed with hunting rifles and shotguns, weapons common to every household in Breathitt County. Jerry Whitaker's wife had given a description. 3 men, 1 older, limping, 2 younger. The older one did the shooting, called him Thomas. Buck Hensley's wife had been sleeping when it happened, woke to the gunshot, found her husband dead in the doorway, saw taillights disappearing into fog, couldn't identify the vehicle. But it was Margaret Morgan who provided the key. She'd been hiding in her bedroom closet with her daughters when she heard Clayton being shot, had peeked through the door crack, had seen Thomas Brennan's face clearly in the living room light, had heard him speak. It was Thomas Brennan, she told investigators, and his boys. I heard him talking to them, Michael and somebody else. They killed Clayton right in front of me. By 2:00 p.m., Sheriff Burke had assembled the timeline. February 3rd, Thomas and Clayton shake hands on timber contract. March 18th, Clayton signs deal with Harlan Woodworks. March 19th, Thomas confronts Clayton, gives ultimatum. March 22nd, deadline passes, no resolution. March 23rd, 11:42 p.m., 1:45 a.m., 6 people eliminated across 4 locations. The motive was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. The only question was whether Thomas Brennan would run or surrender. By Wednesday afternoon, news had spread through Breathitt County like wildfire. 6 dead. The Brennan family responsible. Everyone had an opinion, and almost none of them agreed. At Jackson Hardware Store, men gathered around the counter arguing over coffee that had gone cold. Thomas Brennan's a murderer, said Rick Campbell, who ran the feed store. Killed 6 people in cold blood over money. Nothing can justify that. Wasn't about money, countered Earl Hopkins, who'd known Thomas for 40 years. Was about honor. Clayton gave his word, then broke it. What's a man supposed to do when someone steals his livelihood and the law won't help? Call the police, Campbell shot back. File a lawsuit, not execute 6 people. Police are 43 miles away, Hopkins said, and lawyers cost money Thomas doesn't have. By the time any of that happened, the timber would be cut and gone. You think the courts would have given him anything? You think Clayton would have faced any real consequences? The argument spread to the diner, to the gas station, to church parking lots. Some said Thomas was a monster. Others said Clayton had violated the most sacred code of the mountains, a man's word given in handshake. I ain't saying what Thomas did was right, said Martha Collins to a reporter from the Lexington Herald-Leader. She was 73, had lived in Breathitt County her entire life. But I understand it. When the system fails you, when someone steals your future and laughs about it, when there's no legal way to get justice, something's going to break. We're all closer to that breaking point than we want to admit. The Morgan family survivors demanded maximum punishment, death penalty, no mercy. But quietly, privately, More than a few people in Breathitt County admitted they understood Thomas's rage, even if they couldn't condone his actions. The code ran deep in these mountains. A broken handshake was still, in some minds, a debt that required payment in blood. While Sheriff Burke and Captain Whitfield coordinated the investigation, while the community argued over justice and revenge, while 6 families began the process of planning funerals they'd never imagined they'd need. Thomas Brennan sat at his kitchen table, drinking coffee, reading his Bible. Same as he did every morning. Same chapter he'd been reading Tuesday. Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him. She hadn't slept, hadn't been able to close her eyes after Thomas and the boys had come home at 2:00 a.m., smelling of gunpowder and fog, refusing to talk about where they'd been. She'd known anyway, the way wives always know. They're going to come for you, she said quietly. I know. You could run, take the boys, head west, Montana maybe. Start over. Thomas set down his coffee cup. Running would mean I was ashamed, mean I thought what I did was wrong. Was it right? He didn't answer for a long time. Finally, it was necessary. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. She walked to him, put her hand on his shoulder. 32 years of marriage, 6 of them good, the rest hard but endurable because they'd had each other. I'll wait for you, she said. However long. They'll give me life. I'll die in prison. Then I'll wait until you die. Thomas reached up, covered her hand with his. I love you, Sarah Lynn. From the first day I saw you until the last day I breathe. Why did you do it then, if you love me? If you love the boys, why throw it all away? Because, Thomas said slowly, a man who lets someone break their word and does nothing isn't a man anymore. He's just meat taking up space. I couldn't live knowing I'd let Clayton spit on my family and walked away. So instead you chose this, chose prison, chose to leave me alone. I chose honor. Sarah pulled her hand away. Honor doesn't keep me warm at night. Honor doesn't sit across from me at this table. Honor doesn't grow old with me. She walked to the window, looked out at the mountains they'd lived in their entire lives. You traded me for honor, Thomas. Traded your boys. Traded everything for the right to say you didn't let a man disrespect you. Yes, Thomas said simply. I did. She was crying now, silent tears running down her face, but she didn't turn around, didn't want him to see. At 3:47 p.m., they heard trucks coming up the driveway. Sheriff Burke led the convoy. 4 vehicles, 8 officers, state police, county deputies, everyone wearing body armor and carrying rifles. They'd expected maybe a standoff. Maybe Thomas barricaded inside with his boys, making them earn every inch. Maybe even a final shootout. 6 more dead to add to the night's toll. What they found was Thomas Brennan sitting on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible on his knees. Michael, David, and Jacob stood behind him, also unarmed, also calm, no weapons in sight, no defensive positions, just 4 men who'd crossed the line and were ready to accept the consequences with the same stoic acceptance mountain people bring to all of life's harsh realities. Sheriff Burke, Thomas said as the older man got out of his vehicle, expect you're here about last night. Burke approached slowly, hand near his sidearm but not drawing it. Thomas, I need you and your boys to come with us. Thomas stood. He moved like an old man, though he was only 57. The weight of 6 deaths had aged him visibly. We're not going to make this difficult. We did what needed doing. Now we'll face what comes next. Burke pulled out handcuffs. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Clayton Morgan, Marcus Morgan, Shane Morgan, Jerry Whitaker, Buck Hensley, and... He paused. Anyone else? 6, Thomas said. Just the 6. You planning to tell me why? They broke faith, Thomas said simply. Took what was mine. I gave them a chance to make it right. They chose wrong. One by one, The Brennan men were cuffed and led to separate vehicles. Michael first, then David, then Jacob, finally Thomas. Sarah stood on the porch watching. She didn't cry, didn't call out, just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, watching her husband and sons being taken away, knowing she'd probably never see them as free men again. As Sheriff Burke put Thomas in the back of his vehicle, he asked the question he couldn't hold back. Was it worth it? 6 dead, your whole family going to prison, your wife alone. Was proving a point worth all that? Thomas looked at his land. At the mountains his family had walked for 3 generations. At the house where he'd raised 3 sons and loved 1 woman for 32 years. At everything he was about to lose. Ask me when I'm dying in prison, he said. Then I'll tell you. The vehicles pulled away, carrying 7 men down the driveway. 7 men who'd protected honor by destroying everything else. Behind them, Sarah collapsed on the porch steps. A neighbor, Linda Patterson, Ruth's daughter, came to sit with her. Held her while she finally let herself break. But the question that haunted Sheriff Burke, the question that haunted Captain Whitfield, the question that would haunt Breathitt County for generations, was simple and terrible. Where exactly was the line between justice and murder? Between defending your honor and destroying families? Between keeping your word and losing your soul? And if they were honest with themselves, really honest, how many of them would have done exactly what Thomas Brennan did if pushed to that same desperate edge? The trial of Thomas Brennan and his 3 sons began in September 1993 in a Lexington courtroom. Venue changed. No possibility of finding an impartial jury in Breathitt County where everyone knew everyone, where the mountain code ran too deep for objective judgment. 24 combined charges of first-degree murder. The prosecution had confessions, forensic evidence, survivor testimony from Margaret Morgan and Dennis Morgan, and a timeline so detailed it left no room for reasonable doubt. Thomas Brennan himself had surrendered with 6 bodies still warm, had admitted everything, had written out a statement explaining exactly why he'd done it. Clayton Morgan gave me his word, shook my hand, looked me in the eye, then broke that promise for money. In these mountains, a man's word is his bond. Break it, and there are consequences. I gave him a chance to make it right. He chose not to. What happened after is on him. The defense, 4 court-appointed attorneys from Louisville who looked overwhelmed from day one, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by economic desperation and cultural tradition. They painted a picture of men driven to extreme measures by a collapsing economy, by the theft of their only livelihood, by a code of honor that predated American law itself. They brought in sociologists who explained Appalachian honor culture, economists who testified about timber country's devastation, Vietnam veterans who spoke about Thomas's military training and how it had shaped his response to crisis. The prosecution destroyed that argument in under 3 hours. Emotional disturbance doesn't involve 2 days of planning, the prosecutor said. Doesn't involve recruiting 7 men, gathering weapons, studying maps, surveilling properties. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated mass murder dressed up in the language of mountain justice. The jury, 12 people from Lexington who understood poverty but hadn't lived Breathitt County's specific desperation, deliberated for 23 hours over 4 days. Guilty. All charges, all 4 defendants. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Thomas Brennan, life without possibility of parole. Michael Brennan, life without parole. David Brennan, 50 years. Jacob Brennan, 40 years. When the judge read the sentences, Thomas Brennan showed no emotion, no tears, no shock, no protest, just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he opened Clayton Morgan's door that this was exactly where the path would lead. The only emotion he showed was when Sarah was led from the courtroom. Their eyes met one final time. Thomas mouthed 3 words. I love you. Sarah mouthed back. I know. Then he was gone. Led away in chains, 57 years old, would die in prison, would never walk his mountains again, would never sit on his porch at dawn, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over Frozen Creek Ridge. All of it for a handshake, for principle, for the idea that a man's word should still mean something. Thomas Brennan served 29 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. During that time, he worked in the prison carpentry shop, teaching other inmates woodworking. He was quiet, caused no trouble, earned respect even from violent criminals through sheer presence and an unspoken code of honor that translated even behind bars. Guards said he never complained, never asked for special treatment, never sought attention, just did his time with the same stoic acceptance he'd shown when they arrested him. Sarah visited every Sunday for 26 years, made the 4-hour drive from Breathitt County to Eddyville without fail, even when arthritis made gripping the steering wheel agony, even when ice made the mountain roads treacherous, even when she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She never missed a visit. They'd sit across from each other in the visiting room, plexiglass between them, phones to their ears, and talk about nothing important. The weather? The garden. Who'd died in Jackson, who'd gotten married, who'd had babies, normal things. As if Thomas were just away on a long trip and would be home soon. They never talked about that March night, never talked about the 6 dead, never asked if it had been worth it. Some questions don't have answers, some wounds are too deep for words. Sarah died of heart failure in 2019, 79 years old. Her last words to the hospice nurse were, "Tell Thomas I waited. Tell him I kept my promise." Thomas wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. Wasn't allowed to say goodbye to the woman who'd stood by him through Korea, through decades of hard mountain living, through the horror of what he'd done and the aftermath that destroyed everything. He received the news in his cell. Sat on his bunk for 3 hours, staring at the wall, not moving. A guard who'd worked at Eddyville for 32 years said it was the only time he ever saw Thomas Brennan cry. On November 7, 2022, at 86 years old, Thomas Brennan died of complications from pneumonia in the prison infirmary. The chaplain reported that Thomas's last coherent words were, "Did I protect my family's honor, or did I destroy my family? I've had 29 years to think about it. Still don't know." He was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple stone marker, Thomas J. Brennan, 1936 to 2022. No mention of father, husband, logger, veteran, murderer. Just dates marking the beginning and end of a life that had transformed from honest work to unthinkable violence over a broken handshake. Michael Brennan remains incarcerated at the Eastern Kentucky Correctional Complex. He's 62 years old now. Parole denied in 2003, 2013, and 23. His 2 daughters, who were 6 and 8 when he was arrested, are now 41 and 39. Both left Kentucky. Both changed their last names. Both struggle with the knowledge that their father killed 6 people over a timber contract. The oldest, Jennifer, visited him once in 2005, sat across from him in the visiting room, and asked the question that had haunted her for 12 years. "Why did you do it, Daddy? Why did you choose Grandpa's honor over us?" Michael had no answer, just tears. The kind of tears that come from a well so deep it can never be emptied. Jennifer never came back. In a rare 2020 interview with a documentary filmmaker, Michael said, "I was 32 when it happened. I'm 62 now. I've had 30 years to think about that night, to see those faces in my sleep. Marcus Morgan was 28, had a little girl named Emma. She's 41 now, probably has kids of her own, kids who'll never know their grandfather because I killed him. Was protecting my father's honor worth that? Was following the mountain code worth making orphans? I still don't know, and that's what keeps me awake at night, not knowing if what we did was unforgivable evil or desperate loyalty gone wrong." David Brennan was paroled in 2021 after serving 28 years. He's 62 now, lives in a small apartment in Berea, works part-time at a library, attends therapy twice a week. He rarely speaks about that March night. In the few interviews he's given, his answers are careful, measured. "I let Dennis Morgan and his family go. That's the one thing from that night I can live with. But I still participated, still helped plan it, still stood by while other men were killed. There's no redemption for that, no amount of time served that balances the scales. I'm out of prison, but I'm not free. Never will be." Jacob Brennan, the youngest, is 58 now, still incarcerated, eligible for parole in 2027. He's the only one who's granted multiple interviews, who's tried to explain what that night was like. I was 27, young enough to think I understood honor, old enough to know killing was wrong. But when your father looks at you and says, "This is what needs doing," when your whole community operates on codes that say a man protects what's his, you don't think, you just follow. I see Shane Morgan's face every night. He was 25, wearing a Wildcats t-shirt, had coffee on the table, still warm, was probably watching TV 5 minutes before we shot him. Was he guilty of anything except being Clayton's son? No, but we killed him anyway because the code said family was responsible for family. The code was wrong. We were wrong, and I'll spend the rest of my life paying for following it. Margaret Morgan never remarried, never left Breathitt County, raised her 2 daughters alone, working double shifts at a textile factory until it closed in 2001, then as a grocery store clerk. She died of cancer in 2018, 73 years old, surrounded by daughters and grandchildren who carried the Morgan name and the weight of what happened to their family. When reporters tracked her down on anniversaries, she'd say only, "They took everything. My husband, my stepsons, everything. And for what? Honor? Code? Those words don't mean anything when you're sitting alone at night wondering how to pay bills." She never forgave Thomas Brennan, never softened, carried rage until the day she died. Dennis Morgan and his family left Kentucky the week after the murders. Changed their names, started over in Tennessee. He's 77 now, retired, living quietly in Chattanooga. He never speaks about that night, not to reporters, not even to his children. The only public statement he ever made was in 1994. "David Brennan let me live, told me to take my family and run. I don't know why. Don't know if it was mercy or weakness, or if something in him broke when he saw my kids, but I'm alive because of it. My children have a father because of it. I don't forgive what they did, but I understand that David was different from his father. That matters." Marcus Morgan's daughter, Emma, is 44 now.